Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar titled Using Data to Improve Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act Services for Immigrants and Refugees. And thanks especially to all of you who are joining early from the West Coast. We're sorry that the schedule just didn't allow for us to make this a little bit later in the day. I'm Margie McHugh. I'm the Director of the Migration Policy Institute's National Center on Immigrant Integration Policy. And before we get going with the webinar, you see here some of the logistics up on the screen. You'll be able to find the slides and audio from the webinar on our website. You can see the web address there. Please give us a call or send an email if you have any problems accessing the webinar. We're regularly monitoring that email account that you see there. And then please use the chat function to the right of the screen to write questions and send them to, Lisa, is your name on there? You can just click on, there we go, so at the events address, so that will, and please send your questions as you think of them. Don't wait, because it's easier for us to receive the questions a bit in advance so we can figure out who's the right person to address them. So with that, let me just say that we are very excited to be releasing these data sheets today. Madeleine Morawski, my colleague here at MPI and Associate Policy Analyst, is a co-author of the fact sheets with me, and we'll both be describing them a bit for you. And then we're delighted that Jeff Carter, who is the Executive Director of the National Adult Education Professional Development Consortium and National Council of State Directors of Adult Education, is here with us to also speak a bit about the overall processes that are underway now in terms of development of state plans and some of the key issues related to immigrants and refugees that are really on the radar screen of the State Directors of Adult Ed. So with that, I already said who I am. So I will just say briefly that this work is, a lot of the work of our center is focused on education pipeline issues. You know, generally we adopt the same frame that many folks in the immigrant integration field have picked up now, talking about the linguistic, economic, and civic integration of immigrants and refugees. A really deep focus of our work is the education pipeline with adult education and workforce training, a key part of that. And as many of you know, we've been working with a wide range of stakeholders over the past year to consider the implications of provisions in the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act for immigrant and refugee communities. And it's partly because of that whole engagement process we had with so many folks that we created these data sheets that we're releasing today. So with that, I'll just say a bit of an overview of the fact sheet releases. First of all, we compare in the fact sheet characteristics of native-born and foreign-born adults, and we're releasing today the U.S. and the top 10 immigrant-receiving states. We cover characteristics that are relevant to adult education and training needs, so those include what you see here on the screen: nativity, age, region of origin, educational attainment, English proficiency, skill underutilization, poverty, family structure and parental status, and immigration status. And I should say that we actually have a lot more data. For those of you who think we maybe have included too much in the fact sheets, we actually have a lot more that we didn't include in them just to make them a more manageable size. So I'll just say that, you know, for any of you who are scratching your heads wondering if, you know, there's a particular other few things that you'd like to have, you should just shoot us an email, because it may very well be that we already have that information available, but it's just not part of what we're publishing today. I figure for all of you who are on this webinar that you probably already know this, but I'll just very quickly say that, of course, adult education and workforce services are critical to the integration of immigrants and refugees. We have roughly 1 million immigrants and refugees settle in the U.S. each year over the last several decades. Adult education, English skill training are critical to helping many of them achieve the sort of economic, civic, and linguistic integration that have been very much talked about over the last several years, particularly with the creation of the White House Task Force on New Americans last November by the President. All of these issues are really being bumped up onto the national radar screen, and certainly now with implementation of WIOA more so than ever. The bad news is that the adult education and training systems have a very weak record of meeting immigrant and refugee needs. Of critical importance for the conversation that we'll be having today, only 1.5% of those who have been served by Title I workforce training funds in the past very many years were limited English proficient. And then adult ESL enrollment has always been way, adult ESL provision has always been way below what the need is in communities, and then it even dropped during the period of the recession and has not fully recovered or even very much recovered. So just briefly in terms of the setup about WIOA, again, some of you or many of you may know this, but we'll be talking a lot about Title I. Title I includes workforce training programs. Those are adult, dislocated, worker, and youth programs, but we'll mainly be talking generally about Title I programs. Title II programs, previously known as the Adult Education and Family Literacy Act, are where all the adult education services are funded from. Those include both services for adults who haven't obtained their high school diploma or equivalent, and also ESL or English acquisition programs. Very, very top line, just from an immigration point of view, Title I eligibility for services is restricted to those who have U.S. work authorization, and in the federal law, Title II does not address immigration status issues, so nearly all states consider those funds to be open to everyone who may need them. And then the other basic point that we just want to make sure we put out there before start getting into the actual data is the performance measures under the new system, because it's such an important underlying issue for many of the data that you're going to see here. The new mandatory performance accountability system that covers both Title I and Title II services, as you'll see here, really favors or really emphasizes, I guess I should say, work outcomes and earnings outcomes and post-secondary credentials or degrees. And so there's a very big worry that many of the goals of adult learners and adult education programs aren't reflected well in these accountability measures, and particularly since adult learners, particularly immigrant and refugee adult learners, are very often not close to or don't have an immediate goal of post-secondary credentials, and so there's very much the worry that the creaming that already occurs in the system, or that many experience in the system with those who are better prepared and in a sense easier to serve, may get worse with the implementation of WIOA and this set of performance measures. However, at the same time, the law places a priority of serving those with basic skills needs, and so that's really the place that folks who are very concerned about immigrant and refugee access have to figure out how to be right in the middle of that tension that's being put under systems, on the one hand, to achieve these goals that very often are very far away from where most immigrant and refugee clients may be at the same time, the law really is opening up a space by saying that they are a priority of service, those who have basic skill needs. So obviously these are very big challenges for stakeholders who want to see systems provide equitable access for the wide range of adult learners and folks who need these services. So, just as a very kind of, our shorthand in talking about this is that there's promise and peril ahead as WIOA is implemented. We think that the focus on post-secondary transition and completion outcomes could help drive services towards better prepared immigrant youth, those who are either second-generation youth or those who came as young children and have had some education here in U.S., in the U.S., but at the same time, there's a very real worry that it will drive services away from folks who are lower educated, parents of young children, and, for example, citizenship applicants. So with that very broad outcome, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Madeleine Morawski. As I said, we're co-authors of the fact sheets. We're very grateful to our colleagues here at MPI, Ji Zhang and Zhana Batalova, who prepared a lot of the underlying data analysis. But Madeleine now will walk through some of the key data points and the discussions that you'll find in the fact sheets. So Madeleine, over to you.
Thanks, Margie. So I'm going to walk through some of the tables in the fact sheets and highlight data points that will be useful when thinking about populations who could benefit from WIOA services, as well as equal access for refugee and immigrant populations. You'll find that the fact sheets go into more detail about the relevance of the data for WIOA implementation, but I will highlight some of what we think are the key points here. I'll start with an overview of the age, gender, and origin of the Native and foreign-born populations, their educational attainment, educational attainment combined with limited English proficiency, and a short discussion of brain waste. So looking at age, gender, and origin, we see the general overview of the foreign and native-born populations. We see that the foreign-born account for about 15% of the overall population, ages 16 and older. A quick note about the age bands. We chose these to correspond with the National Reporting System, which is used by WIOA-funded adult education providers. So looking at the data, we see that immigrants are more likely to be younger, and they're also more likely to fall into what we would consider the prime working age, the 25 to 44 and 45 to 59 age bands. Even within these age bands, they're more likely to be younger, and will probably be in the workforce for many years to come. So they're likely to be of the ages that are targeted by states with these programs. Similarly, they're less likely to be over the age of 60, whereas the native-born tend to be older. Looking at region of origin, the three main groups are from Latin America, Europe, and Asia, with over half of all immigrants from Latin America, 28% from Asia, and a slightly lower percent from Europe. We've chosen to talk about educational attainment because it is such a significant factor in determining who receives adult education services. We've further broken the table into two parts here to discuss youth and adults, who are some of the key categories, as Margie mentioned earlier. WIOA varies from the Workforce Investment Act because it has a priority for serving out-of-school youth. States and localities are supposed to spend a minimum of 75% of their WIOA Title I youth funding on out-of-school youth, which, as you can see here, are defined as those 16 to 24 who aren't attending school. And they also have to meet one of a variety of other characteristics, including if they're a dropout, involved in the justice system, pregnant or parenting, or anyone who needs additional help to complete education or access employment. It's also important to note that even those with a high school diploma or equivalent can still be considered out-of-school youth if they are low income and basic skills deficient or LEP. So it's likely that many immigrant youth will be eligible for out-of-school youth services. Looking at the table, we can see that immigrants are more likely to be out of school or not enrolled in both the 16 to 18 and 19 to 24 categories. And if among those who are not enrolled, they're more likely to be working. So if they do enter an education or training program, they will be considered probably non-traditional students and may require additional support. So moving on to adults, those 25 and older, we see that, again, immigrants are overrepresented among those without a high school diploma or equivalent. They account for 37% of all adults ages 25 and older without a high school diploma, compared to the 15% they represent of the population overall. and they're almost 3 times more likely to lack the high school diploma or equivalent. But it's also important to note that there are many highly educated immigrants. They're about as likely as the native-born to hold a bachelor's degree or higher, and within this college-educated immigrant population, over half obtain this education abroad. So there's a lot of information on this table, but we thought it was very important to talk about the overlap between those who are limited English proficient and those who have lower and higher levels of education. We see that there are 22.8 million limited English proficient individuals 16 and older in the U.S., but they are not counted in the adult education funding formulas. Only those without a high school diploma or equivalent are taken into account. We see that there are a significant portion of limited English proficient adults who are also low educated, over 10 million. And comparing this to data in the earlier tables, we see that about 1/3 of all low educated adults are also limited English proficient. This is very significant for WIOA services since the traditional model has been sequential, meaning that an LEP adult could be required to spend years in ESL classes before progressing on to a high school equivalency and then on to workforce training. Under WIOA, English language and workforce training are supposed to be integrated, but we predict that this will be one of the biggest capacity building challenges for states since sequential models have been most prevalent. Finally, we wanted to highlight the fact that there are almost 3 million LEP adults who already have a bachelor's degree or higher, and therefore may be at risk of brain waste, which I will discuss in the next slide. So brain waste is the term that we use to refer to when a college-educated individual is unemployed or employed in a low-skilled job. Immigrants are more likely to suffer from brain waste compared to the native-born, 24 versus 18%. And from the earlier slides, we see that many immigrants were educated abroad and are LEPs, which are significant factors in determining who is affected. So the fact sheets cover some additional indicators that I won't talk about in depth here, but those are family structure and parents of young children, where immigrant parents are significantly more likely to be low educated, low income, and LEP. Poverty status, which is very important for determining eligibility for many WIOA programs. Immigrants are again more likely to be in poverty or low income. They're also more likely to lack health insurance. And finally, immigration status, which Margie touched on, restricts eligibility to Title I programs. There are 10.2 million unauthorized individuals who won't be able to access Title I. And then there are also a significant number of limited lawful permanent residents who, if they are eligible for naturalization, could benefit from naturalization services or civics education. So back to Margie, and she will discuss some of the variations we saw across states.
Great. Thanks, Madeleine. So we were trying to decide how to handle the state level, the state level fact sheets and what to present about them, because we know that probably most of you who are on the phone are more interested in state and local data, but there's really only so much that we could cover in the time we have right now on the webinar. So I thought I would just take a few minutes to point to some of the most important issues some of the most important issues that we see across the state level fact sheets. So the first is what you see here on the screen, the issues related to foreign-born individuals and their representation among those who are basic skills deficient. So the first bullet point there, the LEP share of a state's low-educated population ranges from a low of 17% in Virginia, 19% in Georgia, to a high of 62% in California. Now, this is not the foreign-born share of low-educated individuals in a state. It's the LEP share. So, you know, foreign-born is an interesting thing to look at as well. Very often, foreign-born, particularly those 25 and over, are several times more likely to be low-educated than folks who are native-born. But this critical piece in WIOA implementation related to trying to break down the silos between adult education and training and accelerate folks towards degrees and credentials is a really one of the biggest challenges, particularly with LEP individuals and especially those who are both low educated and LEP. And we think this is also one of the great opportunities under the law where there is this priority of service now, an automatic priority of service for having basic skills deficient individuals be able to access Title I funds, Title I workforce training funds. And so we think this particular point and this particular percentage, which goes quite high in a number of the top 10 states, is really one that we suggest that folks take a close look at and figure out its implications or articulate its implications in their state planning processes. At the same time, it's really interesting to look across states and see that in nearly all of our top 10 states, that higher educated LEP residents predominate, and meaning that of course, this is the whole issue about how LEP individuals and immigrants and refugees just have, they span the whole educational spectrum. And so another issue that really hasn't been well addressed in the past under WIA, under the WIA regime, I guess I would say, the Workforce Investment Act regime, is that you had many people who are LEP who have a high school diploma or some college or even professional degrees, and that very often the workforce system has said to them, go and take a lot of time to fix, quote unquote, your LEP issue, and then you can enter our training programs. And we think that's an entire, a really, really open question now with this priority of service for Title I, and maybe even, we'll see a number of folks in different states trying to reopen the issue of whether, in fact, it's even national origin discrimination to deprive folks who are LEP of access to Title I services that states decide to fund with their, with the Title I funds that come down to their state. Then a third really interesting thing to us was that LEP individuals actually outnumber low-educated individuals in 3 states. Now, that's interesting partly just because, as Madeleine said earlier, the only folks who count, in a sense, in the funding formula that drives money to states for Title II services are those who are low-educated. So it's extremely, it really points out a big policy issue here that, first of all, in nearly all the states, LEP individuals are very close to the number of low-educated individuals, pointing to, I would say, some serious issues in how we think about the funding formula. But then the fact that they actually predominate in 3 states drives the point home even harder. And then we're very interested to see how those states then handle issues around priority of service and the like, because traditionally systems have mainly thought in terms of LEP, go and fix your LEP issues first, then come and address your high school diploma or equivalency, then have access to the Title I services. Well, it first of all sort of flips the sense of, it should flip, I would say, the sense of priority for states that LEP individuals outnumber low-educated, and then what are the implications for breaking down the silos that have existed for so long in terms of the structure of these systems. Then you see there this issue of the, we're very interested, I guess I'll say, in how all of you are thinking about your state rules regarding implementation of the Title I priority of service, because we've even heard that many states can't tell us how many LEP individuals have been served in the past under their Title I services because they don't even have it as a field that's reported. So the question of how states are the ones who are going to be writing rules for the priority of service, and we would say based on all these data, it is absolutely critical that that definition of the priority service and the rules for implementing it that states set are really closely scrutinized by folks who are concerned about access for LEP individuals, because at a minimum, we have to make sure that information about a person's LEP status is being collected, never mind then how, how the actual rules then of how it's applied are going to play out. And then lastly, just on this issue of how we think about foreign-born and the basic skills deficient priority of service, there also are issues then related to equitable use of Title II funds for folks who are low educated and or LEP, because we've seen in a lot of our field research at the state level that, for example, Title II funds are increasingly being used by K-12 systems to try and help young people meet graduation requirements, for example. And so when you think about the accountability system and the value that it places on post-secondary transition, you can see very quickly that there could become issues in terms of Title II funds being equitably available to the wide range of LEP individuals in a state who all are legally able to be served by those funds, but where the space for them to be served might shrink as states seek to primarily serve people who can get them credit under the accountability system for post-secondary outcomes. And then the other set of issues I just wanted to point to, whoops, but did I do something? Oh, there we go. The other two issues that I wanted to point to quickly are the Farmborn Share of low-educated parents of young children. Those of you who know our work know that we place a great emphasis on policy and practice in the early childhood space, given the large number of young children in the country who are from immigrant families. We are deeply worried under WIOA implementation that what had been a focus, even a primary part of the title of Title II, Adult Education and Family Literacy, that those types of services for parents of young children may disappear in many states as the law is implemented, precisely because of the lack of value placed on those systems, those services in the accountability system, and actually the penalty that states might face if they serve a large number of low-educated parents who aren't going to be able to help them then show that they're demonstrating post-secondary transition and the like. And if you look across the 10 states in the fact sheets that we're releasing today, it's really essentially half, at least half in all 10 states. You know, Georgia's 47%, 49% in Georgia, Florida, and Virginia. But most of the states that we're releasing are over half, 50, 60%, up even to 78% in California. Parents of young children who are low educated are predominantly foreign-born in all of these states. And so it really points to the, we're moving forward in all of these states with a focus on the early childhood space, the importance of making those kinds of investments, at the same time that the primary system that has been there to help immigrant parents get information about local systems, figure out what everyone means when they talk about kindergarten readiness, family literacy, how to prepare their children to succeed in school, those programs, there really is a disincentive, we think, to serving those folks. And so we're very interested to see what states might do. They could defend just saying that low numbers of individuals who are in those programs will meet the employment and other goals that are outlined in the system. They may stand strong and do that. We hope that many will. We actually heard some conversation at the National Immigrant Integration Conference this past weekend where some folks are even suggesting that maybe states should pull some of their state match money out of the WIOA system and just directly fund some of these services. But anyway, that's a really key issue. And also, if you look across states at the lawful permanent resident share of non-citizens It's a low of 38% in Georgia, a high of 66% in Florida, ranges from a low of 238,000 in Virginia to 2.7 million in California. In the past, EL Civics money had been available to provide citizenship preparation and assistance to lawful permanent residents and those seeking citizenship. The way those services have now been defined under WIOA, many of you who follow our work and the comments we all submitted when the regulations first came out were very surprised that the Obama administration, the Department of Ed, Department of Labor, first of all, that there's a discrepancy in the law where really the definition of IELCE says that states may combine those services with workforce training, but then in another part of the law, it says that they, in a sense, that they must, and the regulations that have been issued, the draft regulations issued by the administration are siding with the must definition, which means that those who are seeking only or mainly to prepare for naturalization really would find it very difficult. There may be no services that states put in place for them. So we think that this is another important issue, as so many folks, and even at the level of the Obama administration, are promoting citizenship, that at the same time the ability to access those services may be greatly reduced as the law is implemented. So with that, it's a great pleasure to introduce Jeff Carter. Jeff has a long history of working in the adult education field. Many of you know him from his time at Pro-Literacy, and now as he's taken over the helm of the National Council of State Directors of Adult Ed. Many of us in the sort of integration policy advocacy field have really appreciated having him as a colleague and are very interested in remaining in close contact with him and the consortium, given all the worries that we have as WIOA is implemented at the state level. So, Jeff, great to have you here, and interested to get your thoughts about where we're at in the process, how folks might use some of this information.
Thank you, Margie. I'm really happy to be with you today, and I want to thank you for inviting me, and also thank you for your work. These fact sheets look like a tremendous resource. I want to start by briefly discussing some of the issues, the top issues that the state directors of adult education are wrestling with regarding WIOA Title II implementation and service access for immigrants and refugees. First, though, I want to start by saying that, in my experience, state directors of adult education have a strong commitment to providing services to immigrants and refugees in their states. Even before I started on this job in May, when I first met with our members to discuss the draft regulations on WIOA, this was a theme that came up time and time again. I hope advocates will consider adult education state directors allies as we continue to go along the process of implementing this law. There are challenges. Margie's mentioned some, and I've outlined a couple here. With regard to integrated education and training for EL Civics, one of the questions that has been a concern during the planning process is the extent to which IET programs for English language learners may need to be modified to comply with WIOA regulations. That, and in many states, IET is itself an underdeveloped program model generally. So in my discussion with our members, I've seen a strong interest in sharing IET models that have been developed in other states. Another issue that I think Margie may have touched on is this issue around collecting data for performance accountability measures. The bullet there says use of Social Security numbers, and what I mean by that is that our members, while they understand that collecting participant Social Security numbers and matching them with quarterly wage rate data is an effective way to measure the performance of the state workforce system, it is actually in some states, either as a matter of practice, regulation, or law, adult education programs do not collect Social Security numbers. Our association supports the language in the law itself that states that act consistent with state law to measure state and local progress on performance accountability, and I would just note there are other ways to do it. I also want to mention, I think this is maybe the most important point, there's a bullet there that says capacity. The law places a strong emphasis on IET and career pathway program models. And as Madeleine mentioned, in many states this will require some significant capacity building challenges, especially to design such programs for individuals with very limited literacy skills, including English language learners. Happily, just this week, it looks like in the fiscal year 2016 omnibus appropriations bill that was released early yesterday, it looks like adult education is going to receive an increase for FY16. But I think a big challenge and opportunity going forward with this law will be leveraging other resources. And on that note, this was also touched on. Some states are exploring the possibility of funding certain programs that serve immigrant adults and families with non-WIOA funds, or as I think Margie mentioned, pulling some of their match funds out instead of tailoring programs to fit under WIOA requirements. However, our survey suggests that a significant number of states that are looking at this are not necessarily doing so directly as a result of challenges posed by the new legislation. It was something that was already being done or in process already. And I think this may, in some cases, turn out to be as much about leveraging resources as it is about WIOA. All right, you can go to the next slide. So I have been on the ground in states to observe the planning process up front, so I can't report on specific examples where immigrant and refugee issues have been discussed with stakeholders in the process of putting together the plans. I've done a scan of, it's probably more than a half a dozen or so draft plans that have been released. They're being released right now at a rapid pace. Draft plans for comment. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. I've looked at some of them, and I haven't seen a lot of detailed discussion of immigrant and refugee needs in any of them. But I would also say that many of the plans do not go into a lot of specific detail on a lot of issues. A lot of issues, I think, will be sorted out in the actual implementation once the plans are approved, particularly when you think about things like the makeup of the workforce investment boards and the grants competition process. Nonetheless, you said two bullets here. Raising awareness is an important thing that our members do in the course of their work. Many of our members do a lot of work participating in efforts to raise awareness of immigrant and refugee issues and success stories in their states. I asked about this recently, and for example, the State Adult Education Office in North Carolina reminded me of their participation in an immigration symposium hosted and organized by one of their community colleges, which focused on students' personal success stories in addition to other guest speakers on immigration laws and issues. This goes back to something I said earlier. I think in many of our states, the State Adult Education Office is going to be an ally in our advocacy on these issues. And lastly on this slide, program models. In addition to what I've already mentioned, in preparation for WIOA, states are working to develop program models that serve the needs of immigrants and refugees that align with the new law. In Washington State, for example, IBEST expansion programs have been developed to create a more comprehensive pathway and include even their lowest level students, including low-level English language learners, in on-ramp programs designed to accelerate students' transition into their well-known IBEST program and other post-secondary programming. I note that among their 4 on-ramp program options includes one specifically aimed at English language learners. Now, last slide, I want to talk a little bit about opportunities for feedback and advocacy. I'm a long-time adult education advocate. I have worked with a number of different agencies and groups in addition to my current position with the state directors. And the way this is supposed to work is that states should be providing multiple opportunities for input into the plans from a broad variety of stakeholders. The notice of proposed rulemaking on state plans proposed by the Departments of Labor and Education back in the spring noted that state plans should be developed in consultation with representatives of local workforce boards, chief elected officials, businesses, representatives of labor organizations, community-based organizations, adult and youth education and workforce development providers. I could go on and on, but a wide range of stakeholders should have an opportunity to provide feedback. The easiest and the most prevalent way I've seen this is on the web. Virtually all states are posting their draft plans online and providing tools that enable people to submit comments electronically. As I said, I have reviewed about a half dozen plans. I expect draft plans, for the most draft plans, to be out sometime in the next 3 to 6 weeks. And generally the draft plans are posted on the state's Workforce Development Board website. But there may or may not be announcements about when it will be posted, so you'll need to check often to find out when the draft state plan will be available for review. So depending on how plugged in you are in the system, you might have to check the website to find out when the draft plan is available for comment. In some states, there are opportunities to comment in person via hearings or other public events. California State Workforce Board, for example, hosted a series of regional events across the state this month. I think their last one is tomorrow, to get feedback on their plan. Some states, there's a bullet here that says multiple iterations, and what I mean by that is I've noticed that some states are posting first drafts with a promise of additional drafts to come, so your opportunities to comment, there may be several of them as new drafts are posted. But I also would warn people that the window of opportunity for comment may be short. Deadlines are looming in many states. For example, the comment period, I just looked at Indiana's plan. They were one of the first out of the gate, but the comment period for their plan ends on December 23rd. Final plans have to be submitted to the Department of Labor by March 3rd, so you can see there's not a lot of time for states to collect feedback, process it, alter the plans, and get them submitted by the deadline. And lastly, I have a bullet there that says roll your own. I would really encourage people not to wait until you're invited to provide feedback. If you are an advocate group or a coalition in your state or locality, organize a meeting yourself and collectively provide that feedback to the folks in charge. Every state's going to be different, and they may or may not have a lot of opportunities for feedback, so I hope that folks will organize themselves and not just wait for an invitation. And with that, I will turn it back over to Margie.
Great, Jeff, thanks so much. So we have a lot of questions rolling in. Please remember to send them sooner rather than later in order to get in the queue. And if we don't have a chance to get to all of them, we'll just reply to you directly. So actually, Jeff, one of the things that I had wanted to ask you just quickly was, is part of the reason, so once the states, is part of the reason that states are asking for feedback so quickly very often on their state plans, because then the state plans get passed down to their local WIBs and that they then have to do planning? Or, you know, like why would a state, if the deadline is March, be saying that the deadline for comments now is now, you know, or, and I thought California's deadline was very close in too for a state that, you know, is just so big and has so many issues in this regard.
I don't know, but I suspect that the way state bureaucracies work, if you think about March 3rd as a deadline for submitting a final plan, you think about, we got the holidays coming up, that really leaves just a couple of months to process everything. And if a state, you know, you mentioned California, multiple events they're having around the state, people are submitting comments on the website, I imagine it will take a long time to process all of those comments. So I think it has more to do with that than anything else. I should also, this is not really what your question was, but I should also point out that one of the challenges in doing these plans is the fact that the final regulations have not been issued yet. So one of the reasons I think some issues are, I don't want to say they're not being addressed, but why there's sort of a more general language or some careful language, some language around planning to plan, and some of the plans that I've seen is because there's concern about doing something that would end up being in violation of the regulations. Mm-hmm. So I think that's really the main reason, and I think it also varies from state to state in terms of the kind of rules that they have for public comment. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So Madeleine, I have a few kind of technical questions for you that have come in. One of them is how are we defining LEP, and then another one, we didn't talk much about the diversity of populations and what the implications of that are. And one of the questions was, do we have more information about sort of underlying levels of languages and countries of origin, which I think we tried to address a bit in the fact sheet. So could you just speak to both LEP and maybe where to find more of that info about languages spoken?
Sure. So throughout this webinar and in the fact sheets, we use the Census Bureau definition of limited English proficient, which is people who report speaking English less than very well. And then in terms of LEP diversity, MPI has some resources on our website. We have some articles through our data hub, and then you can download some spreadsheets with the LEP population by state, and as well as some data on the linguistic diversity of LEP individuals at the state and county level. Another valuable resource is the American Community Survey. Makes various tables online through the American Fact Finder website, which is another good resource for looking up some information on linguistic diversity. And then finally, I'll just mention that the Census Bureau came out with some more detailed definitions recently. I believe they're 5-year estimates about more detailed language breakdowns for languages that are not apparent in the broader categories they use for the shorter estimate.
Great, thanks. And then also there was a question of whether high school diplomas obtained outside the U.S. are counted in the educational attainment data.
I believe they are, yes.
Yeah, right. The census question is simply about the highest level of educational attainment. So, so Jeff, I wish we could unmute everyone, because with the questions that are coming in, I know we have a lot of folks who are extremely well informed and opinionated about these issues.
I hope so.
But let me start with one of the questions, or send this question to you, Jeff, about whether how many states are writing combined, do we know how many states are writing combined plans versus unified? And would combined plans be better for promoting English language acquisition services?
You know, I have to apologize. I was anticipating that question, and I meant to bring my latest data on that, and I don't have it with me, so I don't want to say something that's wrong. But I will. I mentioned before we started the webinar today, any questions I'm not able to answer, I will be posting something in a follow-up blog post. We have been surveying our members and keeping track of that. Sometimes it has changed as the planning process started, say back in the spring. Some states did move from starting off thinking they were going to do a combined plan and then moving to a unified plan. As far as whether a combined plan would serve the interests of English language learners, you know, honestly, I think it just depends on the plan. I don't think that in itself solves all of the issues. It certainly provides an opportunity to think about more of the kind of resources that can be leveraged to serve their needs. So I think there's a sort of a presumption in my mind that it should be, but I don't. It would all depend on, you can write a combined plan that avoids or doesn't address issues just as you can write a unified plan. But I take your point. I think it's certainly something that I hope some states are looking at. Right. We've been trying to. I mean, there's been a lot of conversations about what are the most potentially the most effective levers for representing the needs of LEP individuals, and I think what you're saying about it depends on other elements of what the state is doing. That's right. You know, because, for example, if you don't, you know, you really could use numbers to try and implement the priority of service, right? If you're not going to be data-based in how you're thinking about the priority of service and being very deliberate about whether or not you're tracking and including LEP individuals to ensure that the priority is implemented, for example, you know, that you're really
you know, it just becomes very squishy then, I would say, about whether services are being equitably provided or not, or at the scale that they need to be provided.
Yeah. The other, I just want to say one quick thing about equity, because this was an issue under the old law and it's an issue now, and and I think it's important to draw a connection between equitable access and capacity. If we had sufficient resources, and again, I'm incredibly grateful to Congress for providing an increase for adult education in FY16, but everyone knows it's not enough, and I think the equitable access becomes more of a problem when there's not enough resources to spread around. So that alone would, I think, help a lot, and again, that goes back to what I was saying before. Without an expectation of a significant increase in federal funding through Title II, then I think the question and the challenge becomes, how do we leverage other resources to meet those needs? Sure.
I'm not disagreeing with you, but I would say that given that we only served under Title I, that access to training funds was training and intensive services, only 1.5% of that was given to LEPs. I think we can actually look within the law to Title I services as a major new source of, you know, funding for LEP services, and that's really the, you know, the first line of battle, I think, for folks who want to see immigrant and refugee communities have more equitable access to services. I can say things that you can't. So Jeff, another
me tough one, Margie.
Another question.
I can take it.
Another question for you was that, or that I think is best pitched to you, is that WIOA allows states to set goals beyond the 6 national measures. I'm not sure how meaningful that is because of the just the weight that the accountability system carries, but I might be wrong about that. So I'm curious, what do you think is the, you know, what do you think we may see in some of those goals? Are we seeing them already? Can they be shared? You know, it just feels like there might be a lot there that folks could learn from, but it feels pretty invisible right now still.
I think, and again, if anyone listening in has an example, I'd love to hear about it. I have not seen any. I don't think it's not so much a question of invisibility, but I think that we may not be there yet. But I do know that states are thinking about that. So that's something we're going to be continuing to survey our members on going forward. But again, that may be happening, and I don't know about it. My suspicion is that it will happen, and we'll know more in the next, you know, 3 to 6 months.
Great. So then there's also a question about whether states have considered changes to licensing and certification laws to allow foreign educated individuals with sufficient language training to continue in their profession. I think that I'm not sure if that's, you know, that's a separate body of work here at MPI. We've tried to support folks in a number of different states that are trying to pursue those issues. I'm not sure that that would come as part of, I mean, Madeleine and Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not sure that would come as part of WIOA plans, and I think when we included the brain waste information in the fact sheets, it was partly to point out how many that there are so many foreign educated individuals who have college degrees or higher, but then also that there were significant numbers of them who are LEP, and in fairness, we think it has proven difficult for states and localities to serve them, in part because it's hard to get economy of scale, sort of with, you know, creating a program that sort of English for professional purposes based on a whole bunch of different professions, and then how would you offer it, you know, right time, right place, you know, for, you know, you just wouldn't have large numbers of people state by state. So I think we all need to think more about, is there some sort of a national solution for that? But anyway, Madeleine, I don't know if there's more to say there. The way we wrote it in the way we presented it in the fact sheets was more to talk about grading of Title I and Title II, I believe.
Yeah, so I think the biggest issue is just whether or not these foreign educated individuals and have access to the English language training that they need to really enter into the careers. You know, aside from the challenge of having your qualifications recognized, there is the enormous issue of English language proficiency. which I think is the part of the brainwaste issue that is most relevant to WIOA, because in the past, I think a lot of programs, they've struggled, in part because much of the adult education funding only goes up to a certain level of ESL, and often these professionals need a much higher level than what is typically offered.
Mm-hmm. And that, we're hoping that maybe Title I services might be a new place to look for those individuals who are very well prepared. And also, we've been thinking that it is that we hope there'll be a re-examination in many states about more direct access for LEP individuals to training programs, particularly those who, certainly for those who have a high school diploma or higher, and obviously there's also an equity argument for those who are lower educated. So a few I guess tough ones,
right.
Jeff.
All right.
One is I think a lot of folks are trying to think about the definition of displaced workers, and how do we think about how immigrants sort of fit in with some of the displaced, dislocated worker definitions. And I'm not sure how much this question means to get at that, as opposed to the just the larger issue of that in many states there are large numbers of immigrant workers who are LEP, less educated, and they are either they've been in jobs that are really been very physical, and as they grow older, how do they transition to other kinds of jobs, gain the skills for that, but also that they may be more directly displaced by business technology changes or the requirements for digital literacy. So I don't know if that's an issue that just really needs to be pointed out kind of state by state in terms of the share those workers are of the workforce, and see if they can kind of fit in as a priority for local WIBs. So I guess partly the question is, are you hearing much, or do you feel that particular states are facing those issues? Is that bubbling up to the surface? And is it an issue more that would just be a local WIB type issue?
I think it's really both. I am hearing that concern or that interest in, and I think it's, if you look at the numbers just generally in adult education, most of the people we're serving are working, and so the question becomes, what are the best ways to provide services to people on the job or who are already working? And I know many of my colleagues who've been around this field a long time would take you back to in the 90s when there were a lot more workplace literacy programs, for example. And I think there's starting to be some interest in going back and looking at some of those models as we go forward with this new legislation. I wouldn't say it's bubbled up in terms of like a major national discussion quite yet. It certainly aligns well with the discussions going on around the upskill initiative that the White House launched a few months ago. I think it's related to that. But I think we're still sort of at the beginning stages of sort of talking about that under this law.
Great. So we have a few questions about DACA Youth, and I'll just say that some of you may be aware that we've published a bit on this. We've done some field work in 7 states looking at education and workforce success of DACA Youth. How are different states and localities trying to adapt their education systems and training systems in order to better serve those youth. And so specifically, I would say that there aren't many local efforts yet, but I think it's a growing recognition around the country that DACA youth are eligible for Title I services. That used to be a big barrier to being able to serve them. And for many of them, as we look at the population, only about half of eligible individuals have come, or potentially eligible the individuals have come forward and applied. Many of those who haven't lack a high school diploma or equivalent and are in their 20s. So we're hopeful that for places that where they have significant numbers that adult education providers, training providers are increasingly understanding that that could be a population that they could have some real success with. And then for the DACA youth that have come forward, very often they have reasonably high levels of underlying education, and of course they're almost more like the 1.5 second generation youth that could be much more easily served by the system in training programs. So I think it's partly an issue of making DACA youth available and encouraging them to come forward to apply for some of the programs that are going to be available locally, while at the same time working with folks at the system level on those issues. So I think we'll just take one more question, because it's pretty significant. It's a question about the tracking of Social Security numbers.
Okay.
And will that mean that undocumented students would no longer be eligible to receive EL Civic services, or even more broadly, I would say, Title II services? So, Jeff, could you just say a little bit more about the implications of tracking of outcomes, you know, through Social Security numbers?
Well, as I noted earlier in my remarks, it's been our position, the State Director's position, that this should not be a requirement for folks who are enrolling in Title II programs. It hasn't been in the past for a variety of reasons, and we're hoping that when the final regulations come out, there'll be support for that position. At the end of the day, this is something we'll have to be negotiated at the state level, and I think what we need to do as advocates is to point out that there are other ways to measure. Obviously, this is one way to do it, but there are other ways as well. And we need to, for our friends on the labor side, they need to understand that it's not that this law didn't all of a sudden change past practice. That this law is just, I've heard people say, well, we've heard from the labor side that now we have to start doing this. That's not necessarily the case. It remains to be seen how it's going to play out in each state. But I think this is it's a really good question, a really good advocacy point.
Great. So we're going to need to wrap up, but any of the unanswered questions that we have, we'll just divide them up amongst the three of us and get answers to you. I guess I just would say, you know, we were talking before we unmuted the phone and started up the webinar, that there are so many opportunities still going forward because things are so unsettled and this is all so new, and so the opportunities to stand up for a lot of the issues that we've been discussing here, to apply data so that, because there really are some things that can be measured, and the equity arguments are that much more powerful with using data and insisting that systems align their data so that we're able to see whether the priority of service, for example, is actually being implemented. You know, there are a lot of levers that I think folks can be using to look at to ensure that there's equitable access to services as planning and implementation moves forward. Also, once the plans are finalized at the state level, there's also what's going to be happening in terms of the Secretaries of Labor and Education needing to approve plans, possibly sending them back because they don't appropriately address important issues, or they leave important equity or discrimination issues, or they raise important equity or discrimination issues and the like. And then, of course, there'll be ongoing efforts in states in the coming years as a lot of the weaknesses in the system become more visible, and solutions to address them are hopefully debated and maybe put into place. So it's been remarkable to us to see how little hard and fast information there is. And so, Jeff, what you were just saying about pushing back, for example, on this idea that we must use Social Security numbers and the like, I would just say to everyone who's, you know, maybe if you haven't been an expert or really been involved in these issues, don't assume even that the experts know, because so many things are still up for interpretation. And so articulating the real issues that you're seeing in your communities in terms of access and the problems that implementation of the law is likely to create, is just a really important contribution as all of this moves forward. So with that, thank you again to Jeff, and thanks to all of you for joining us. And we're very happy to get any questions from you via email. So you see up on the screen there how to reach each of us.
Oh, great.
And so, oh, sorry, Jeff, I hope it's okay.
That's fine.
All right.
Can I just say one more thing?
Sure.
Not only do I promise to answer any questions we didn't get to, but I also promise to improve some of my answers to the questions we did get to.
Okay, great.
In case there's something I left out.
Okay, great. All right, so thanks again, everybody, for joining us, and happy holidays to everybody. Bye-bye.